My first guest at the Swiss Economic Forum is Niall Ferguson, history professor at Harvard University. Hi, Mr. Ferguson.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, in your new book called Civilization, you mentioned the game, also called Civilization by Sid Meier. Have you played that game?
Yes, very badly with my young sons who always beat me at it.
Are there some similarities between the game, and your way of looking at history?
I certainly think that history is more like a game than a novel or a play, in the sense that the outcome is not predictable at the beginning, and there are multiple players, and it's a very complex system. If one thinks about the economic history of the world, it helps, I think, to imagine a giant game in which different civilizations compete for resources, compete for territory, and so on. And technological change is often the key to victory in the game. I think that's a reasonable description of how the past has unfolded, and it's what a game like Civilization very roughly approximates. Of course, a game like Civilization is a caricature, it's a simplification of the historical process, but I think it's still more accurate than the kind of stories that we read our children at night when we know there's going to be a happy ending. History isn't like that.
You do also virtual history. What would have happened, let's do a mind game, what would have happened if the US government would have saved Lehman Brothers? Would we live in a complete different world now?
I don't think it would be so different, though I think the financial implications of bailing out Lehman would have been really much more dramatic than many people claim. After all, what the failure of Lehman Brothers did was to make it clear that it was possible to fail, even if you were important, if not hugely big. And I think that was a very important signal to the US Congress that unless there was a significant injection of money into the banking system, then much bigger firms than Lehman would go down. Citigroup, Bank of America, AIG. So you needed to have at least one significant failure pour encourager les autres in order to ensure that there was some kind of coherent bailout. In Europe, there hasn't been a Lehman Brothers event. All the banks have been bailed out, no matter how badly run that they've been. And I think that's one reason why Europe's banking crisis is still going on, whereas the bank crisis in the United States is very much in the past.
The main opinion is that it was an error not to bail out Lehman. So you disagree with the majority?
Well, that's right. And the reason that I take this minority position is that I think a bit more rigorously about the past than the average Wall Street commentator. You can't just say, if they'd saved Lehman, Dick Fuld would be a happy man and there wouldn't have been a financial crisis. One, the financial crisis was already well underway. It had begun in the spring of 2007. Two, if Lehman had been bailed out, there would have been a political revolt in Congress against bailout money going to Wall Street bankers. And three, that would have made it very hard indeed to get TARP, which was the crucial bailout measure, passed. After all, it had already failed in one vote, and it only narrowly passed the second time after the Lehman failure. So I think with a serious historical analysis, you see that there really had to be one major failure to convince American legislators of the gravity of the situation. I think bailing out Lehman would have created another bigger problem further down the line. And for example, if Lehman had been bailed out, but Congress had said, that's the last bailout, we'll not bail any more people out, then AIG and Citigroup would probably have gone down. And they, of course, had much, much bigger systemic significance than Lehman Brothers. So one always has to ask oneself, when doing virtual history, what was the real alternative scenario? Because I don't think it was a case of they all live happily ever after and the financial crisis goes away just if you bail out Lehman.
In your new book, you have like 6 killer apps. It's competition, science, property, modern medicine.
The consumer society
and
the work ethic.
Yeah, so isn't this also like a little sort of simplification if you reduce it to the six killer app who led West to dominate the world?
I don't think it is a simplification. In fact, if you try to explain the rise of the West historically after 1500, that's really the dominant story of world history. Most books that I've read in the past offer one or two explanations. So in offering 6, I think I'm making life rather more complicated than most historians. And I think it's hard to imagine another critical factor in the rise of the West beyond these six. If one just goes through them one by one a little carefully, we're talking here about economic and political competition, which I think was really crucial in the 1500s in setting Europe on a different path from China. We're talking about the scientific revolution in the 17th century that transformed the West's view of the natural world. We're talking about not just the rule of law and private property rights, but the whole system of representative government that developed in countries like Switzerland and England and didn't develop anywhere else. And then you've got modern medicine, the consumer society, without which there's no point in having an industrial revolution, and the work ethic. Now, I defy your readers and listeners to come up with some additional thing that I've missed, or to tell me that one of those things is superfluous. I think you need all six of these things to explain the extraordinary ascendancy of the West relative to the rest of the world from the 1500s down, well, to as recently as the 1970s.
One of your killer app is work ethics, and if you compare Europeans with Asians, they work a little bit less. Do you see this the same? And what has Europe to do to try harder again?
Well, it's really quite a big differential that's opened up in terms of working hours. So the average Korean works about 2,400 hours a year, and the average German 1,400. So that's a huge difference in the amount of work that's being done. And the Germans are by no means unusual. In Europe as a whole, there's been a significant decline in the average number of hours worked every year. Now, this takes all kinds of different forms. It includes early retirement, very long holidays, unemployment. But however you look at it, Europeans are probably the laziest people in the world today in terms of the amount of time they spend working. And that's a cause for concern. In some countries, including Germany, we can say, well, when they work, the Europeans work very efficiently. They have very high productivity, higher than elsewhere. But I don't think that can be said of every country. And indeed, that's one problem we're seeing in the Eurozone today, that if everybody works German hours but not German productivity, you end up with a major crisis in a country like Greece or Portugal.
So how can we rise productivity in Europe as a whole?
Well, I think there's a major problem in some European countries, and that's to be found in education. Today, the productivity of workers is quite closely correlated to the quality of education that they receive. And one of the things I show in Civilization is the enormous differential that's opened up in attainment in mathematics at age 14. So we can see that Asians are teaching their kids mathematics much more successfully than Europeans are. And that means that when it comes to doing complex jobs in the high-tech workplace of the 21st century, a lot of our kids are struggling. And of course, that's what leads to low productivity.
So you talk a lot about killer apps, about downloading those into the system. You see, though, is it like a software every country can copy the West?
I think that's part of the argument that I'm making. These things arose in the West, but they weren't exclusively owned by the West. It was actually quite easy to copy them, so it wasn't proprietary content. Take, for example, the institutions that produced the Industrial Revolution, not to mention the technology. That was pretty much open source. Anybody could come and copy the way that the English were making textiles in the late 18th century. And the first non-Western society to do that was, of course, Japan. In the late 19th century, Japan embarked on a campaign of systematic replication of Western institutions and indeed even the Western way of dressing. And that's part of the process that I'm describing when I say that Western predominance is coming to an end in our time. Nowadays, it's not just Japan, it's also China, it's India, indeed it's most of the Asian societies that are copying our killer apps, our killer software. And that means that the world is becoming a lot more equal than it's been for many hundreds of years.
And you think China has already downloaded every killer app and will Will it get stronger than the United States?
Well, the critical point is that China has not downloaded all 6 of my killer apps. The third one, in which private property rights and the rule of law safeguard individual freedom and then give rise to representative government, that is not there, and they don't want it. And so one of the interesting experiments that we're seeing in the world today is China attempting to have all the benefits of Western economic institutions and scientific institutions, the consumer society, and so on, but wanting to avoid Western-style political institutions because the Chinese argue if they tried to have Western-style democracy, the country would plunge into chaos and possibly even disintegrate. And I'm not sure whether they'll be able to pull this off. In other words, I'm not sure whether it will be possible to have a Western-style economic system, a Western-style scientific system, but no representative government, no move in the direction of political freedom. That's going to be the really critical question of the 21st century. Will they overtake the United States economically? Yes, they will. That's going to happen very soon. But whether they will be able to maintain a stable political and economic system when they combine capitalist economics with one-party communist rule, I think that's much less clear.
I want to make another point. China, people who predict they're going to rise and get more powerful, but everyone in China wants to live the American way of life, wants to dress like that, American brands, watch movies from Hollywood. So can China become as powerful as the US without having these soft powers?
Well, I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which Chinese movies are displacing American movies in the Chinese market. I don't know when you last were in China, but if you go, you will not see the Hollywood blockbusters in the cinemas. You will see Chinese blockbusters, and the same is true on television. And while it's true that the Chinese are certainly dressing in a Western way and have done really for a couple of decades now, I'm not sure that they're thinking in a Western way, and that's a really important distinction to draw. I think that China's soft power is growing fast, particularly in other emerging markets, because after all, China is the biggest market for many emerging markets. Take Brazil, for example. Brazil's trade with China has overtaken its trade with the United States. And as long as China is the #1 market, it is going to be a very popular country with those exporters in South America and in the rest of Asia.
One of your killer apps is consumption, but isn't consumption nowadays causing more problems than solving? It seems if everyone in China would consume on Western levels, your killer app would kill the whole planet.
Yeah, I think that's a really legitimate question, and it's one that I raise at the end of the book. If you imagine a world in which everybody else consumes just half what the average American consumes in his lifetime, it's amazing how quickly we run out of stuff. We run out of lead, we run out of tin, we run out of copper in a matter of decades. And of course, we may very well run out of breathable air if things carry on in that way. So there's a major problem developing, which is that if a fifth of humanity, that's the population of China, aspires to live the way Americans live, which is a pretty wasteful way in terms of energy consumption, there's going to be, at the very least, a shortage of fossil fuels and very high commodity prices, and at the very worst, a major climatic disaster. So the big challenge in the 21st century is going to be coping with the unintended consequences of Asian wealth, the environmental consequences, and that is going to mean technological innovation has to happen. If we do not get better at producing energy than we currently are, then I think the world is going to have a very serious economic problem, even if the environmental fears of some people are overdone.
Will we see new imperialism in Africa as we start seeing between USA and China fighting for resources in the next 50 years?
I think it's difficult to see that right now because the United States shows so little interest in what is happening in Africa. I've just been in Zambia and I spent part of last year in Namibia and Senegal, and the evidence is very clear of Chinese ambition to acquire more natural resources there, and indeed to deploy significant numbers of Chinese workers and entrepreneurs there. The Chinese population in Africa is growing very fast, but this is a scramble for Africa in which only one country is scrambling, and the rest of the world is essentially watching rather passively or not watching at all. Could there end up being clashes over natural resources? Well, such things have happened in the past. And I think as it becomes apparent just how limited the supplies of some minerals are, the stakes are going to get high, and it is conceivable that there will be arguments about not just oil, which of course there have been arguments about before, but some of the base metals and some of the rare earths. We've just recently seen the extent to which China's control of rare earths markets gives it a real lever, just as we've seen how Russia can use its natural gas exports to Europe to give it some political leverage. So I think we can expect at least some political friction over natural resources in the future, even if not outright war.
If we look forward, let's say you're going to write Civilization Part 2, has the humanity developed new killer apps to meet the challenges of the future, like overpopulation, limit to growth we spoke about? What would those new killer apps be?
Well, my sense is that we already have the most important killer app, the most important thing to deal with the problems we're discussing, and that's science. The great breakthroughs of science that began in the 17th century and continued through to our time give, I think, the best reason for hope about the future of humanity. We have encountered all kinds of constraints on the growth of the human population in the past, and we've overcome them. And so I think there's a reasonable chance that if we continue to invest time, effort, resources and talent in the natural sciences, then some of the problems that worry us today in 50 years' time will seem like distant nightmares.
Mr. Ferguson, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
For this interview.